I'm Rob Bell, an engineer with a thirst for understanding how things work. Join me on a journey to investigate the incredible structures that have stood the test of time and their ground during what was to become a global war. "1940, following the fall of France and the devastating defeat at Dunkirk, Britain stood alone against the onslaught of the unstoppable Nazi menace. With her back against walls not yet built, construction began on an epic project, transforming this green and pleasant land into an impregnable island fortress.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender."
Churchill's rousing speech of defiance laid out the plan for Britain's defence. Each week, I'll be exploring the streets, hills, and landscape he spoke of to uncover the monumental, mysterious, and heroic buildings that helped us win the war. Today, nearly 80 years later, thousands of seemingly random structures still litter our countryside. In many cases, they're just blocks of concrete you might see during a daily commute or pass by on a weekend walk. But if you know what you're looking at, behind these remnants of bricks and mortar, there's a much darker story to be told. It's a tale of terror and fear. At a time when fascism overran the rest of Europe, Britain stood alone. Today, often all that's left to remind us of those dark days are these crumbling remains. But in their day, they were the buildings that fought Hitler. Winston Churchill may have been confident that Britain could win the war, but to do so, there had to be a nationwide effort to build robust military strongholds and incredible tactical structures. By keeping the fight away from our shores and instead looking to the skies. As an island nation rich in resources and commanding a strategic position, Britain had always been a target for foreign invasion. There were the Romans, the Saxons, and the Vikings, but the successful conquest by the Normans in 1066 was the last. Since then, many had tried. There was the Spanish Armada and Napoleon, but Britain held firm. A combination of naval strength, geographic location, and the good old British weather kept our shores safe from foreign invasion for nearly 1,000 years. But by the late 1930s, everything had changed. The Luftwaffe, Germany's crack air force, were fearless fighters. Our island of vast coastlines and industrious cities were under threat from bombs jettisoned overhead. Adolf Hitler's barbaric form of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, had already annihilated whole swathes of Europe. And no matter how industrious the groundswell of our steel, bricks and mortar, it was clear the enemy we faced was brutal. In June 1940, France fell, and the British Army retreated to the last possible port of evacuation, Dunkirk. Stranded on the beaches and under constant aerial attack, the now famous miracle of the small ships plucked over 330,000 troops and brought them back to British shores. Although we did get most of the men back, they were in a sorry state. And the vast majority of their vehicles, equipment and weaponry was abandoned in northern France.
But we needed to stay in the fight as Hitler set his sights on Britain.
In the summer of 1940, it is imperative that Nazi Germany doesn't just beat the giant, the superpower of France, but also Great Britain. Anything other than complete defeat of Great Britain will not be enough.
After the fall of France, we needed to pull together and have a cohesive plan of action.
Britain was really fearful of a Nazi invasion. There was an era of defeatism. I think that people were literally, after Dunkirk, were sitting there going, when is Hitler and his filthy hordes going to be walking down Whitehall?
Britain's strategy was to harness all available manpower and machines, not just military. A heinous battle lay ahead, one that would begin offshore.
We still had the most powerful navy in the world and the RAF. But a whole support network of new structures was needed.
They had to be daring, innovative and robust, to exist on the landscape, yet defeat enemy observation, to look harmless, yet be lethal.
You've got to remember that the southern coast of Britain is incredibly long. It's around 400 miles long, all the way from Kent down to Cornwall, and all that needs defending. There's a lot of places that Hitler can attack, and there are a lot of places he can attack from. So you're going to need all sorts of new and clever ways of defending that coast. You can't just build a load of forts. This is not an old-fashioned war. This is a highly modern war, so you're going to need highly modern solutions if you're going to defend the British Isles.
Air superiority would be vital, but Britain knew it was up against a formidable foe.
When the Nazis come to power in January 1933, they very quickly expand an air force. And this is the largest air force in the world. It had combat experience. It supported the nationalist troops in the Spanish Civil War. It was highly sophisticated, and it had over 4,000 aircraft. It had bombers and it had fighters, and over 400,000 men were serving in the Luftwaffe in this period.
Germany's battle-hardened army and ferocious air force looked set to conquer, with a leader who had yet to fail.
Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, is a very bumptious and confident individual. He hasn't really seen anything go wrong in military terms. So that's why you have this incredible confidence in the Nazi hierarchy, all the way up to Hitler, who's assured, of course, by Goering, look, I can do this job. The Luftwaffe can basically do the whole of this invasion for you.
Goering believed he could destroy the British RAF in just 4 days. But he was unaware that for the last 10 years, British Air Chief Marshal Dowding had been quietly creating the best air defence system in the world.
The Dowding system is an integrated system. It's not just getting planes up in the air. You also need radar stations, you need barrage balloons, you need searchlights. You need all these things to be able to talk to each other. It's got to join up, it's got to make sense. It can't act independently.
The battle for superiority in the skies was on, while the race to prepare on the ground forged ahead. Secluded within hundreds of acres of park and woodland, Bawdsey Manor near the Suffolk coast is one of the most remarkable buildings adapted for military use. This once private, rather ominous stately home, built in 1886, was swiftly requisitioned for use as a top-secret military research station. Bawdsey became the centre of groundbreaking scientific development, and specifically, one structural device that would give us the upper hand in aerial warfare. Mary Wayne and Graham Randall have both headed up the Bawdsey Radar Trust.
It was the first operational radar station in the world. Built around 1937, it became a template then that was used around the coastline of the country. This site was selected for a number of reasons. They needed a site that was remote because No one could talk about radar. It was the top secret of the time. They needed to be away from everybody. They also needed more space, and they needed preferably to be elevated, so with a cliff looking out towards the continent.
The manor became indispensable, and it did so by making use of a £1 million government research grant. That's £68 million in today's money, which was spent on creating the RAF's Radio Direction Finding Training School.
They brought in more WAFs and engineers and scientists to develop the system, still in really a prototype stage.
The radar detection system used radio waves to determine the range, angle, and speed of enemy aircraft. But in August 1937, the technology was still in its infancy. The station was successful to a degree, but could only provide a long-range early warning system for the North Sea and Channel approaches. A short-range system was still desperately needed. Research work continued by both servicemen and women, one of whom was Mary's mother.
When she was posted to Broadsea, she said, well, what's Broadsea like? And they said, oh, it's out in the middle of nowhere. It's bleak and horrible. They turned into the manor, and the driver said, this is your billet, girls.
The research operation undertaken at the old manor was just one of many covert roles it played during what was to become the Battle of Britain. Standing on these white cliffs, on a clear day you can see France. In places it's just 21 miles away. This was the area we had to dominate. But back then, no one knew if our radar technology was evolving fast enough to keep the enemy at bay.
In 1940, Britain was on the brink of being invaded by the seemingly unstoppable Nazis. With our army battered after the beaches of Dunkirk, the only way of keeping the enemy away was the Royal Air Force.
Air superiority is absolutely vital. You've got to remember, airplanes were only invented a few decades before, but suddenly it's realised if you can dominate the air, you can dominate the ground.
Flying from repurposed and often amateur aerodromes across southern England, the dashing British pilots in their iconic Spitfires and Hurricanes took to the skies. Victory was a possibility because radar, the technology developed at Broadsea Manor since before the war, was changing the course of history. Now, our aircraft could be in the right place at the right time to meet the enemy head-on.
Our secret weapon during the Battle of Britain had been something known as Radio Direction Finding, RDF, otherwise known as CH, Chain Home Stations. And what they wanted to do was be able to use radio waves to detect the approach of enemy aircraft. And by 1939, we had 21 of those stations assembled all across Great Britain.
The familiar radar towers that by now covered the east and south coasts of Britain formed a ring of early warning stations.
The Germans didn't know that we had it. Before the Second World War, they were actually filming along the south coast and along the east coast, trying to get shots of these stations to try and work out what they were for.
At 110 meters tall, the masts were double the size of today's electricity pylons. The Germans failed to realize that these radar transmitter towers were bouncing radio waves off their aircraft onto receiver towers. That flight data was then relayed to our fighter pilots. Their success was dependent on these towering steel structures.
The mast behind me is the last surviving chain home radar mast that was built in the Second World War. There are one or two others around which have had the limbs from the mast removed, but this is now the only one that's completely intact.
The genius behind an embryonic idea that grew into such an impressive and highly effective military solution was scientist Robert Watson Watt, a pioneer in radio physics.
He'd been working on detecting lightning strikes and plotting where lightning strikes happened around the country. So he was commissioned to take a look at how that might be appropriate for detecting aircraft.
A whole series of trials were conducted at secret locations to develop this extraordinary information relay system.
An experiment was set up in the early 1930s, and they flew a Hayford bomber towards the Daventry BBC radio transmitter, which is broadcasting a massive amount of radio waves, and they set up in a field some wires, some aerials, to see whether they could pick up reflections of the radio waves off the aircraft back to the ground. And they could. They proved that radio waves would bounce off the aircraft and could be picked up back on the ground.
The masts might have been the most visible and therefore vulnerable element of the system, but there was a lot more to radar than these structures. And this groundbreaking technology and the inspiration for it was in fact largely conceived in another great British institution, one that helped us get through the war, the pub.
On Dorset's south coast, Charlie Newman's family pub has been a popular place to be for centuries.
My mother's family were in the village in about 1640, but then my great-grandfather took over the business in 1907, so I'm fourth generation, and it's been in the family 113 years.
In May 1940, the pub got some new regulars. With a fast unfolding war, the researchers at Bawdsey urgently needed a new location. With the old manor now a target for aerial bombers, Worth Matravers became a suitable new site.
The location is relatively flat with a sort of uninterrupted area to the channel. So for broadcasting and receiving, it was an ideal opportunity for the radar network. There was upward of 2,000 people stationed there over the early part of the war. And obviously they sought out the nearest watering hole, which happened to be the square and compass. As we all experience, sometimes when you've imbibed a little bit, you suddenly have those light bulb moments.
So in this pub and surrounding structures, a safe distance from German-occupied territory, and inspired perhaps by a few pints, the top scientists continued developing the technology to make radar more effective. The weakness had always been its inability to track low-flying aircraft. The scientists needed to create a new radar capable of low-level detection and test it without raising suspicion.
One of the scientists covered his bicycle in tin foil and then was instructed to cycle along the top of the coast path. And they were actually able to track its course along the top of the cliff. And that was basically one of the moments they discovered that it was all working and it could be done.
The new system, called Chain Home Low, resulted in 30 new stations being built, making it now possible to detect enemy aircraft at all altitudes over water. But it was clear that radar stations were now coming into range of enemy aircraft. Reports of what this vast site might be up to had started to filter through to the Nazi fighter command.
The Germans became aware that something was going on in Worth Matravers. They did actually come and strafe the camp and bomb it. And my dad was only 9 years old, and he just jumped in a steel water tank that's just opposite the camp down in the village. And he actually witnessed the cookhouse being blown up. I think a couple of people were killed. So that was my dad's experience of the war.
Today, other than a few outlying buildings, nothing remains of the site. The whole setup disappeared almost overnight.
Eventually, I think in '42, after the camp was possibly becoming vulnerable, the whole camp then got moved up to Malvern, And it was literally overnight, and they hired the entire fleet of removal wagons, and they literally packed everything into these vehicles and just drove the whole thing up to Malvern. The scientists, all the equipment, everything was moved over a few days. So subsequently Malvern eventually seems to get some of the credit for radar, but it basically was done in Worth Travers.
Despite the many years and locations needed for research, it was here at Bawdsey Manor that chain home radar all began. The work and lives of the radar personnel were so at risk that specialist structures providing protection were swiftly installed.
So the building has got a number of unique features to it. We've got an earth bank protected by concrete blast walls. We're on the front line here. So the expectation was that Germany would send aircraft and bombers to try and knock out these stations.
As a high priority target for the Luftwaffe, Bawdsey didn't get off lightly. It was bombed on at least 12 occasions.
If a bomb landed nearby, then the blast would go over the top. The building itself has got a bomb-proof roof. The way this has been done is to construct a sandwich with concrete, with shingle as the filling, and then another concrete layer at the bottom of that sandwich. The theory being, if you get hit by a bomb, the energy of the blast is absorbed by the shingle, which flies hundreds of feet into the air. And hopefully, everybody and everything inside the building is safe.
These huge earth revetments saved the station and many lives, those of skilled operators fundamental to winning the war. But with the Luftwaffe making strategic strikes, before long, our airfields would become a prime target.
Throughout the late summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain raged above the south coast. From airfields under constant attack, the RAF's fighters flew thousands of sorties against the German Luftwaffe to keep the skies clear.
RAF Kenley near Purley, along with Biggin Hill and Croydon, was one of the three main fighter stations tasked with defending London. Today, its remaining buildings and runway make it one of the UK's most intact fighter airfields to have survived the war.
It's still an active RAF station after 102 years. The land was chosen here because it was flat, it was high.
Linda Duffield is a volunteer with the RAF Kenley Revival Group, which aims to preserve and protect this historic station. Although Kenley had an illustrious career in World War I, by the late 1930s, the airfield needed upgrading, ready for the new types of modern aircraft being brought into service. Fighter planes, capable of attacking formations of bombers with greater visibility and steadiness for shooting.
In this photo, you can see the Hurricanes of 3 Squadron in 1938. This was a very significant moment. These Hurricanes were the first to be brought here, the first of this brand new technology, these new monoplane fighters, and they had tremendous difficulty landing them on this, what was quite a small and cramped airfield. There needed to be expansion and that the concrete runways needed to go in.
The concrete and brick remains that survive today tell the story of that expansion and upgrade, and how men and machines were prepared and protected by a framework of simple yet effective structures.
Shooting was such an important skill to have mastered by everyone, not just the pilots. This is Kenley's rifle range. It was a 50-yard range. You can see the wall that would have been behind a bank of sand with the targets in this concrete ditch here. There's a kind of a revolving mechanism there, and people would have fired from just under that wall there. There was a shelter that people stood under to fire from, and the point of this is that every service person on this airfield, as Churchill said in June 1940, every man in RAF uniform ought to be armed with something: a rifle, a Tommy gun, a pistol, a pike or a mace. It must be understood by all ranks that they are expected to fight and die in defence of their airfields.
It was clear that the danger lay not only in the air for our intrepid fighter pilots, but here on the ground too, where our planes awaited dispersal, being maintained around the clock. But nowhere at the station was more at risk of direct attack than the runways.
Here's Kenley spread out before us. So this was very visible, very open, and obviously very vulnerable. We're looking here at a potential place where they could land troops, parachute in. So on the airfield, there would have been 3, we think, Pickett Hamilton forts, and they were kind of like a little pop-up gun position to defend those runways, and then they could be lowered again afterwards so that they didn't get in the way of aircraft coming in and out.
The inconspicuous gun position was formed from 2 concrete cylinders. A compressed air-driven jack inside one of them activated the pop-up. The main idea behind these forts was to maximize the element of surprise. But most of the structures built were far less complicated, and yet highly effective.
It was absolutely vital that you're going to have this air force, it's going to defend, the Nazis flying over, but also you need an infrastructure to keep those airplanes safe. I mean, it's even something as basic as having a sort of a horseshoe-shaped embankment around every plane on every airfield. It's absolutely vital.
If you put all your armed and fueled fighter aircraft into a hangar and they were hit, then the whole lot would go up in one go and you'd lose everything. Also, in terms of getting them in the air, shuffling them all out of a hangar isn't going to work. You're not going to get in the air very quickly that way. These pens are brilliant. The central wall will protect your fighter from blast if one side is hit. And all of this is unskilled labour, cheap materials. It's just earth revetments and a bit of brickwork. The central walls don't even have foundations. So this could be put together really, really quickly. This is the entrance to the shelter at the back of our restored blast pen. As you can see, it's constructed from precast concrete. We thought that all of the shelters would be of a consistent construction, and in fact they're not. These are precast concrete, this one. We've got others on the other side of the airfield that are poured concrete. We've also got others that are corrugated steel, like an Anderson shelter. And all that is testament to how quickly all this was thrown together. This is something where everybody has just grabbed whatever they can and improvised, and a lot of this work was done after war broke out.
The defences were put to the test on the 18th of August 1940, on what was considered to be the RAF's costliest day of the entire Battle of Britain. Kenley was attacked by waves of German Dorniers, the Luftwaffe's intimidating heavy bomber.
They came over just above the level of the trees. The bombs they had were fused to go off at 50 feet. And basically they came over the airfield so low that many of them didn't detonate and just skittered across the airfield.
But the damage inflicted was still significant. 2 of the remaining 3 hangars and 10 aircraft were destroyed. The runways were riddled with bomb damage and cratered by direct hits.
The Luftwaffe was so confident of their success that they had a war reporter and a war photographer on board. And he was still photographing as he came over. All of them suffered damage.
Kenley survived because its many structures helped ensure that, although damaged, it was never bad enough to render it fully out of action.
The pilots, planes and airfields were all obviously vital to keeping an invasion at arm's length. But when it came to defending our airspace, the secret weapon, the force multiplier that made the system really powerful, was increasing the number and capability of these steel constructions. It was having an integrated defense network and a means of sharing information around that network.
That embryonic idea that first began at WWII was fast developing into something more significant. The IT infrastructure being designed and built was progressing at pace. They didn't know it at the time, but it would eventually become one of the most important technological advances in British history. These fragments of masts and mortar, together with a remarkable group of service personnel, were soon to give us a fighting chance of soaring to victory.
By September 1940, the skies above me would have been filled with thousands of planes, as Goering's Luftwaffe sent wave after wave of fighters and bombers across the Channel, attempting to destroy our airfields and radar stations and pave the way for an invasion.
But with an increasingly overstretched and diminished regular army, there was now a desperate need for a new force to man the structures that kept our shores and skies safe. This new task force, a mix of raw recruits and volunteers, proved crucial to the war effort, and none more so than the Women's Auxiliary Air Force.
The WAF were formed in June 1939, and about 180,000 women served in the WAF during the Second World War. These women were telegraphers and plotters, they were barrage balloonists, they were drivers, a whole range of different occupations. These were young women that had been entrusted with highly secretive work.
And nowhere was more secretive than Bawdsey Manor in its early days of research. Women like Mary Wayne's mother, who was based here, faced a bleak prospect if they broke the code of silence.
They had to sign the Official Secrets Act. People didn't talk about, they weren't allowed to talk about it. I mean, there are stories where people will say that they were told, well, what if I do? And they would have been told quite brutally, well, you'll be shot. This was a very, very significant part of our history and indeed our heritage. The contribution of women and their stories in radar, it's a story that really needs to be told.
Throughout World War II, both chain-home low stations and coast defence equipment for tracking enemy ships were being utilised. And Bawdsey Manor, once a pioneering research station, became a hive of activity on the operational front line.
So within this operations room, you'd have a massive, great big table with a map on it, and you'd have maybe 8 or 10 WAF, women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in uniform, with these very large metallic rods, a bit like croupier rods, moving these counters, which basically said how many aircraft there were, their position and their height, and these would be continually moved around. And then in a gallery overhead, you would have men who were basically controlling the battle as it was taking place, and they would be the one that would be calling scramble to the air bases.
Throughout the war, often in sparse rooms and windowless basements, this army of reservists and volunteers were working with ever-evolving technology. Radar was proving pivotal in gathering highly sensitive and tactical information.
This information was then fed back to the main RAF nerve centres, sites like Uxbridge, Box and Duxford, where the famous fighter controllers and plotters would decide on how to respond to the raids.
At the time of the Battle of Britain, we could see the German aircraft actually taking off and forming up in groups over France.
Before the enemy had even crossed the Channel, a decision to intercept could be made. One phone call was all it took to scramble our fighters, sending them skywards. Despite being outnumbered 4-1 by enemy planes, even before takeoff, they knew where, when, and at what height they'd engage the enemy before diving in for the kill.
And this was the key. If you can have the warning, you can get amongst the enemy aircraft and you can do the damage to them before they do the damage to the targets that they receive.
But even with all this high-tech infrastructure, if the enemy aircraft did manage to break through, we'd be left dependent on much more basic measures.
Because there was a weakness in the system, a chink in the armor of our radar defense.
The trouble was, the stations that are set up around Great Britain could detect aircraft coming over the channel. Anything over water, great. Anything over land, no good at that time.
Despite our cutting-edge technology, every day was a bitterly fought battle. And if the bombers did make it through and take out one of our stations, it often came down to doing things the old-fashioned way.
Our basic radar worked because it covered clear, open spaces, such as from cliffs out over the sea, where it could detect advancing planes without interference. But there was a flaw.
As soon as the aircraft went over land, their radar stopped being operational. So they needed to rely on volunteers.
Volunteers armed with a basic and somewhat old-fashioned tool, binoculars.
We still had to rely on the men of the Observer Corps and their posts all across Britain to monitor enemy aircraft as they approached across land.
The Royal Observer Corps was a civil defence organisation created to visually detect, identify and track aircraft flying over land in Great Britain. They were the ultimate plane spotters.
So you have 30,000 men by 1939 who had trained themselves how to very quickly count the number of aeroplanes and kind of estimate at what height these planes were flying at.
The Observer Corps ran for 70 years until 1995. And today, our frontline RAF fighter stations still depend on a similar integrated intelligence system. The aircraft might look very different, but fast jets like the Eurofighter Typhoon are today's Spitfires and Hurricanes, our frontline aerial defense. But they're still dependent, just as they were in 1940, on wider support systems to operate effectively.
We have everything here that enables flying operations. We see the aeroplanes and everyone sees the visible part, but what we don't see is all of the logistics chain that go behind that.
We're on high readiness to deploy on contingency operations at a moment's notice across the globe.
It's the same alliance of men and women, buildings and structures that do the same job. An alliance formulated back in World War II.
As the war progressed, massive amounts of research work was done in this country to get shorter and shorter and shorter wavelengths and to produce something that was more like a searchlight than floodlight. By the end of the war, we had radar systems in aircraft. They had a small aerial in them, and we were able to even detect submarine periscopes, which helped us beat the German U-boat threat in the Atlantic.
Exposed to the elements, at times in little more than a brick shelter, the men may have survived, but few of the outposts have. Here on the south coast at Newhaven is one observation post that is still standing. This often underestimated branch of the system played a significant role, giving advance warning to the station at Kenley that danger was approaching. One isolated observation post successfully tracked a lone enemy fighter crossing the Northumberland coast until it crashed. The capture of one of Hitler's most trusted henchmen, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, was the Royal Observer Corps' greatest success. His testimony at the Nuremberg trials 5 years later would expose the horrors of the Nazi machine. From cutting-edge radar research stations to boys with binoculars on windy cliff tops, every body and every building played a vital role in relaying information to keep our skies safe.
Armed with that final confirmation, fighters from bases like Kenley could be scrambled within a matter of minutes and be in the right place and at the right height to hit the Germans every time, without wasting fuel or exhausting the pilots by flying standing patrols.
The Battle of Britain, and I have heard in recent reportage, is described as the first battle fought entirely in the air. Well, I'm afraid I have to throw that out and disagree. It could not have been won without anti-aircraft defence, without the Observer Corps, without coastal guns. So the few, well, they were the axis of the Battle of Britain. They turned it against the Germans. But it was a team effort of all those involved, and that should never, ever be forgotten. It was a close-run thing. So yes, the Battle of Britain was fought in the air by the few, but we must not forget the many that backed them up.
And that's how these often decaying structures and buildings helped win the Battle of Britain.